The rain at Fort Bragg didn't fall, it drove itself into the concrete like a million tiny nails. It was 2 o'clock hours. A time when the world was supposed to be dead. Or at least pretending to be. Captain Silas Vance wasn't sleeping. He hadn't slept a full night since his wife, Sarah, passed away 3 years ago. Now, his nights belonged to the ghosts of memory, to the bottom of a lukewarm coffee cup, and to the endless, mind-numbing piles of logistics reports that kept the United States Army pretending it was a perfectly oiled machine. Silas was a man carved out of duty. At 36, his face bore the weathered lines of 3 combat deployments and the quiet, crushing exhaustion of being a single father to a 9-year-old girl named Lily. Lily was his anchor. She was the only reason he hadn't put his fist through a commanding officer's jaw and walked away from the uniform entirely. Tonight, Silas was walking the subterranean corridors of Sector 4. The air down here was different, recycled, sterile, tasting faintly of copper and industrial bleach. He was heading toward Vault 9, a highly restricted weapons bay housing experimental and black project munitions. For the past 3 weeks, Silas had been finding discrepancies, phantom serial numbers, requisitions for high-grain match ammunition that vanished from the digital ledger the moment they were signed. He had filed 3 separate reports to his superiors about the missing inventory. 3 times, he was told to let it go. Clerical errors, they said, but Silas Vance didn't believe in clerical errors when it came to weapons capable of punching through armored glass at 2 miles out. He approached the heavy steel door of Vault 9, swiped his badge, punched in his 16-digit passcode, pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. The hydraulic locks hissed, a heavy, mechanical exhalation. The thick steel door drifted open. Silas expected the suffocating silence of an empty armory. Instead, what he got was the sharp, metallic clack of a bolt assembly sliding perfectly into place. Instinct bypassed conscious thought. In less than a second, Silas had his sidearm, a customized Sig Sauer M17, drawn. His stance wide, the tritium sights leveled straight ahead into the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the vault. Hands, Silas barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Show me your hands, now. Sitting at the central stainless steel workbench, illuminated by a single, high-intensity halogen lamp, was a woman. She didn't jump, she didn't gasp, she didn't even look up. She was dressed in dark civilian clothes, a tactical jacket over a simple black Henley, dark cargo pants, and boots that looked like they had walked through every hell on earth. Her hair was a raven black, tied back in a severe, messy knot, but it was her hands that caught Silas's attention. They were moving with a fluid, terrifying grace over the disassembled guts of a Chaitak M200 intervention, one of the most devastatingly accurate long-range sniper rifles ever engineered. I said, hands where I can see them, Silas repeated, stepping fully into the room, keeping his weapon trained on her center mass. You are in a restricted facility. Step away from the bench. The woman picked up a microfiber cloth, slowly wiping down a heavy fluted barrel. Her movements weren't hurried, they were surgical. Your safety is off, Captain Vance, she said. Her voice was a low, smooth alto. It didn't tremble. It sounded like a woman ordering black coffee on a Tuesday morning. Your heart rate is hovering around 120. Your grip is tight, a little too tight on the lower 3 fingers. Which means if you pull that trigger, your shot is going to pull low and left. And at this range, a low left hollow point will shatter my pelvis instead of hitting my heart. It's a messy way to die. And it's a hell of a lot of paperwork for you. Silas froze. The absolute lack of fear in her voice was unnatural. It was predatory. Who the hell are you? Silas demanded, keeping the gun leveled. How do you know my name? Slowly, deliberately, she set the barrel down. She turned on the steel stool to face him. Her eyes were a pale, striking gray. They were eyes that looked like they had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. I know your name, Silas, because I know everything about you, she said softly. I know you've been working late because the house feels too quiet since Sarah died of ovarian cancer in 2023. I know your daughter, Lily, has a peanut allergy and sleeps with a stuffed rabbit missing its left ear. And I know that for the last 21 days, you've been sticking your nose into inventory manifests. Looking for 408 Cheyenne tactical rounds that you think are being stolen by cartel smugglers. A cold spike of adrenaline drove itself into Silas's spine. He took a step closer. If you know so much, then you know I won't hesitate to drop you right here. Badge, now. She didn't reach for her pockets. She simply gestured to the partially assembled Chaytak on the table. I didn't steal the ammunition. Captain, I used it. Silas stared at the weapon. That rifle is a prototype. It's not supposed to be field tested for another 6 months. The military tests weapons, the woman corrected, her gray eyes locking onto his. I use them to solve problems the military pretends don't exist. My name is Mara Thorne, though the people who sign my blank paychecks usually just call me Wraith. You're a contractor, Silas said, the pieces failing to fit together in his rigid, rules-based mind. Even if you are, you don't have clearance for Vault 9. Mara finally reached into her tactical jacket. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger, but she merely pulled out a matte black keycard and tossed it onto the steel table. It clattered against a box of high-grain rounds. Silas glanced at it. It didn't have a barcode. It didn't have a DOD seal. It was completely blank, save for a small, embossed silver emblem of an eclipsed sun. Run that through your scanner, Mara said, but let me save you the trouble. It's an Aegis Zero clearance. It overrides the base commander. It overrides the Pentagon. If I wanted to, I could walk out the front gates of Fort Bragg with a tactical nuke in a duffel bag. And the guards would salute me on the way out. Silas didn't lower his gun. Aegis Zero is a ghost story. A myth guys whisper about in the barracks. It's not real. If we weren't real, who took out the cartel summit in Juarez last Thursday? Mara asked. Silas blinked. The Juarez summit, a massive gathering of 3 rival cartel bosses. A gas explosion had allegedly leveled the building, killing all 3. It was all over the news. Gas leak, Silas said instinctively. Mara let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had any joy in it. A gas leak doesn't enter through a reinforced window at Mach 2.5. A gas leak doesn't adjust for a 14-knot crosswind. And a gas leak doesn't hit a target the size of a grapefruit from 3,200 yards away, factoring in the curvature of the Earth and the Coriolis effect. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. 3,200 yards. That was nearly 2 miles. It was a shot that shouldn't be mathematically or humanly possible outside of a controlled vacuum. You're lying, Silas whispered. Mara turned back to the workbench. Without looking, her hands moved over the rifle. Click, clack, snap, in less than 10 seconds. By touch alone, she had the massive bolt-action sniper rifle fully assembled. She racked the bolt. The sound was deafening in the quiet vault. Gravity pulls a bullet down, Mara said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence. It was the voice of a professor lecturing on a subject she had mastered 1,000 lifetimes ago. Wind pushes it left or right. But at 2 miles out, Silas, you aren't just fighting wind and gravity. You are fighting the rotation of the planet. The Earth is spinning underneath the bullet while it's in flight. You have to aim where the target is going to be rotated to. Not where they are. You have to read the mirage in the air. You have to feel the barometric pressure in your teeth. She looked at him over her shoulder. You don't take a shot like that, Captain Vance. You surrender to it. You let the math hollow you out until there's nothing left inside you but the trigger. Silas slowly, finally, lowered his sidearm. The gun felt incredibly heavy in his hand. He was a seasoned soldier. A man who had seen the worst of humanity in the sandbox of the Middle East. But standing in this sterile room, looking at this woman, he felt like a child staring into the abyss. Why are you telling me this? Silas asked, his voice rough. If you're a ghost, why let me see you? Mara picked up a custom-fitted pelican case from the floor and laid it on the table. She began breaking the Chaytak down again, placing the pieces into the molded foam. Because you're a good man, Silas. You follow the rules. You file your reports. You try to keep the lights on in a world that desperately wants to burn. She snapped the case shut. The sound was like a coffin closing. But the rules are a lie. The rules are just a bedtime story we tell the public so they can sleep at night. She hoisted the heavy case by the handle. She walked toward him. Silas didn't move. As she passed by, she stopped, her face mere inches from his. He could smell gunpowder, ozone, and something cold, like winter air. Stop digging into the missing inventory, Mara whispered, her eyes boring into his soul. Go home to Lily, hug her tight, help her with her math homework, and forget you ever saw me. Because if you keep pulling this thread, you won't just unravel your career. You will unravel your reality. And where I live, in the dark, there is no room for fathers. She walked past him, her boots silent on the concrete floor. Silas stood frozen, his sidearm hanging loosely at his side, the hum of the vault's ventilation system suddenly sounding like a ticking clock. Wait, Silas called out, turning around. But the hallway was empty. The heavy steel door was already gliding shut. There were no footsteps, no shadows, just the faint, lingering smell of gun oil and the crushing realization that his world had just fractured permanently. Mara Thorne was gone, but Silas Vance knew, with a sickening certainty in his gut, that this was only the beginning. He had looked into the abyss. And the abyss knew his daughter's name. Captain Silas Vance stood in the empty corridor outside Vault 9, the steel door sealed tight behind him. He stared at the spot where Mara Thorne had vanished, his mind desperately trying to categorize the last 10 minutes into something rational. A contractor? A ghost? A warning? He holstered his Sig Sauer M17, rubbing a hand over his exhausted face. He needed coffee. He needed to check on Lily. He needed to write a report that no one would ever read. Then, the lights died. It wasn't a flicker. It was a brutal, instantaneous severing of the power grid. The subterranean corridor plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt heavy. For 2 agonizing seconds, the only sound was Silas's own breathing. Then, a deep, mechanical groan reverberated through the concrete floors as the localized backup generators kicked in. The emergency strobes flared to life, painting the hallway in violent, pulsing slashes of crimson. Code red. The klaxons didn't blare. That was the terrifying part. Down in Sector 4, a silent alarm protocol meant one thing: an active, highly lethal intrusion. Silas's earpiece crackled to life. But instead of the frantic chatter of the base's quick reaction force, he heard a wash of heavy static. Jamming. Someone had thrown a localized comms blanket over the sector. You didn't do that for a smash and grab. You did that for an assassination. Where I live, in the dark, there is no room for fathers. Mara's words echoed in his skull. They weren't here for the prototype munitions. They were here for the ghost. Silas drew his M17 again, his thumb automatically sweeping the safety off. He moved to the edge of the corridor, pressing his back against the cold concrete. He checked his corners, moving with the muscle memory of a man who had cleared houses in Fallujah. 50 yards down the hall, at the primary intersection, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was a man in full tactical blackout gear. No unit patches, no flag. His face was obscured by a panoramic, 4-tube night vision optic that looked like the eyes of a mechanized spider. He carried a suppressed Mk18 carbine, sweeping the muzzle with a terrifying, robotic precision. He wasn't a soldier. He was a cleaner, an eraser. Silas didn't shout a warning. You don't read Miranda rights to a shark. He brought his pistol up, aligned the glowing tritium sights with the intruder's center mass, and squeezed the trigger twice. Crack, crack. The 9mm hollow points sparked off the intruder's heavy ceramic plate carrier. The man stumbled back a half step, but didn't fall. He immediately pivoted, bringing the suppressed carbine to bear on Silas's position. Peefed, peefed, peefed. Concrete dusted Silas's face as 3 suppressed rounds chewed into the wall inches from his ear. Silas dove into a recessed alcove, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was outgunned, unarmored, and blind to the enemy's numbers. Footsteps. Not running, walking. They were advancing methodically, pushing him into a corner. Target is pinned. Flanking. A digitally altered voice clipped through the hallway. They weren't even whispering. They knew they had the tactical advantage. Silas dropped the magazine of his M17, checking his ammo in the red strobe light. 14 rounds. Against level 4 body armor. He might as well be throwing rocks. Unless he could make an impossible headshot in the dark. He took a breath, preparing to step out and make his final stand. He thought of Lily. I'm sorry. Kiddo. Before Silas could move, the hallway erupted. It wasn't gunfire. It was the sound of a predator dismantling its prey. From the ceiling scaffolding above the intersection, a figure dropped directly behind the advancing eraser. It was Mara. She didn't have the massive Chaitak sniper rifle anymore, she held a compact, suppressed personal defense weapon, a heavily modified MP7. She didn't shoot the man in the armor. As she landed, she drove a karambit knife upward, slipping the curved blade perfectly under the rim of the man's Kevlar helmet. Severing his brainstem, he dropped like a marionette with its strings cut. Two more pushing from the north stairwell. Captain. Mara's voice cut through the dark, crisp and entirely devoid of panic. Keep your head down. Silas watched in stunned disbelief. Mara didn't fight like a soldier. She fought like a conductor leading a symphony of violence. She used the pulsing red emergency lights to her advantage, moving in the split seconds of darkness between the flashes. Two more erasers breached the corridor, their laser sights cutting through the dust-choked air. Mara tossed a small, metallic cylinder down the hall. Flashbang? Silas thought, shielding his eyes. No, it was a strobe jammer. It emitted a blinding, chaotic frequency of light designed specifically to overload and burn out panoramic night vision goggles. The two erasers yelled in pain, tearing the heavy optics off their faces. In that 3-second window of blindness, Mara stepped out from cover. Peefed, 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 peefed. 4 suppressed shots. Both men went down with perfect, symmetrical bullet holes in their visors. Clear, Mara said, stepping over the bodies, not even checking their pulses. She knew they were dead. Silas stepped out of the alcove, his gun still raised. Who are these guys? They belong to Director Vane, Mara said, her eyes scanning the ceiling. They're Aegis Zero's internal cleanup crew. They tracked my biometric signature when I accessed the vault. They aren't here for a firefight. They're here to erase me. And anyone who saw me. She looked at Silas. That includes you, Captain. A sudden, heavy crash echoed from the maintenance door to Silas's left. They had been flanked. A massive eraser, built like a linebacker, burst through the door, a tactical shotgun leveled squarely at Mara's back. She was too far away, completely exposed in the center of the hall. Silas didn't think. He lunged. He slammed his entire body weight into the massive intruder just as the shotgun discharged. The blast blew a hole the size of a dinner plate into the concrete wall, deafening Silas in his right ear. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and Kevlar. The eraser was a monster of a man, easily outweighing Silas by 50 pounds. The man dropped the empty shotgun and drew a serrated combat knife, driving it down toward Silas's chest. Silas caught the man's wrist with both hands, his muscles screaming under the crushing downward pressure. The serrated tip hovered an inch above his sternum. Silas could smell the man's sweat, sour with adrenaline. Die quietly, the eraser hissed. Silas shifted his hips, using his leverage to twist the man's weight off center. With a primal grunt, Silas swept his knee upward, catching the man in the floating ribs, and simultaneously drove the palm of his hand upward, smashing into the cartilage of the man's nose. The grip on the knife loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all Silas needed. He ripped his M17 from its holster, jammed the barrel directly into the gap under the man's armpit, bypassing the body armor, and pulled the trigger twice. The heavy eraser went limp, collapsing heavily onto Silas. Silas shoved the deadweight off, gasping for air, his hands shaking violently. He looked up, expecting to see Mara covering him. She was gone. The hallway was empty. Mara? Silas coughed, struggling to his feet. Nothing, just the strobing red lights and the smell of blood and cordite. Suddenly, heavy boots echoed from the far end of the primary corridor. More laser sights swept the walls. It was the second wave of erasers, 4 of them, advancing in a tight diamond formation, heavy shields raised. Silas was trapped in a dead-end maintenance corridor. His M17 was nearly empty. He had no cover, no backup, and his right ear was ringing a high-pitched tone that made him dizzy. He raised his pistol, aiming at the narrow viewing slit of the lead shield. It was a hopeless shot. He was a dead man. You don't take a shot like that. Captain Vance, you surrender to it. From somewhere deep inside the walls of the base, a heavy, concussive THOOM vibrated through the floorboards. It didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a vault door slamming shut at the bottom of the ocean. A split second later, the lead eraser's heavy ballistic shield violently shattered. The man was thrown backward with the force of a freight train. The second man in the diamond formation dropped instantly. His helmet completely caved in. Silas stared in shock. There was no line of sight. The attackers had been behind a solid steel barricade at the end of an L-shaped corridor. Silas looked up. Near the ceiling, 60 yards away, was a 12 by 12 industrial ventilation grate. A perfectly round hole had been punched cleanly through the thick steel slats. Mara hadn't run away. She had repositioned. She had assembled the Chetak M200 somewhere in the mechanical levels above. Calculated the exact angle of the ventilation shaft. Factored in the thickness of the steel grate. The ballistic drop of the heavy .408 round. And fired a shot that threaded the needle through the ductwork, punching through a level 4 ballistic shield and neutralizing 2 heavily armored targets with a single bullet. It was a shot of mathematical perfection. It was terrifying. The remaining 2 erasers, realizing they were being hunted by a phantom who could shoot through walls, broke formation and retreated, dragging their dead into the darkness. The silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. A minute later, the base's main power flickered back to life. The harsh white fluorescent lights buzzed on, banishing the red nightmare. The distant wail of military police sirens began to echo through the facility. The QRF was finally arriving. Silas stood alone among the wreckage and the bodies. He looked up at the tiny, perfect hole in the ventilation grate. He realized then that his life, as he knew it, was over. He had stepped into the crosshairs of Aegis Zero. He was a witness to an invisible war, and men like Director Vane did not leave witnesses breathing. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He brought up a photo of Lily, smiling, missing 2 front teeth, holding her stuffed rabbit. If he stayed in the light, they would kill him. If he ran, they would find him. There was only one place left to go. Into the dark. The interrogation room at Fort Bragg didn't look like a place where the truth was uncovered. It looked like a place where the truth was quietly, surgically buried. It was 8 o'clock hours. 6 hours since Silas had nearly been gutted in the subterranean corridors of Sector 4. 6 hours since a phantom named Mara Thorne had shot a hole through a ballistic shield, through a ventilation grate, and through the fabric of Silas Vance's reality. He sat at a scratched aluminum table. His uniform was stained with dried blood and concrete dust. His right ear was still ringing a high, hollow note. The 2 men sitting across from him didn't wear uniforms. They wore cheap, charcoal gray suits that fit a little too well across the shoulders. They hadn't offered their names. They hadn't offered him water. They had just placed a manila folder on the table between them. A pressurized valve failure in the primary cooling line. Captain Vance, the man on the left said. His voice was as flat and colorless as his tie. That's what caused the structural collapse in Sector 4. Silas stared at the man, his jaw tight. A pressurized valve failure. Yes, the man on the right chimed in, tapping the manila folder. The concussive force knocked you into a bulkhead. You suffered a grade 2 concussion. In your disoriented state, you discharged your sidearm at a shadow, hallucinating an armed intrusion. It happens in high-stress environments. You've had a rough few years. Silas. The brass is empathetic. Silas let out a dark, bitter laugh. It scraped his throat like sandpaper. A hallucination. I snapped a man's nose cartilage. I shot an intruder point blank under the armpit. There were bodies. 4 dead men in level 4 body armor. I saw them. The man on the left leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. Base security was the first to arrive. Captain, they found ruptured pipes, damaged concrete, and you. Unconscious. Alone. You scrubbed it, Silas whispered, the terrifying realization washing over him like ice water. Aegis Zero hadn't just bypassed the base's security. They owned it. They owned the cleanup crew. They owned these 2 empty-eyed suits. Captain, the man on the right said, his tone shifting from bureaucratic drone to quiet menace. You are going to take 6 weeks of mandatory administrative leave. You are going to go home to your daughter. You are going to rest. And you are going to forget this acute stress episode entirely. Because if you don't. The suit didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Silas looked at the manila folder. It was a fabricated reality. Signed, sealed, and sanctioned by the United States military. He realized then that he wasn't a soldier reporting a breach, he was a loose thread hanging off a very dark, very expensive tapestry. And if he pulled on it, they wouldn't just cut the thread. They would burn the whole house down. Understood, Silas said, his voice completely hollow. They let him walk out the front gates of Fort Bragg. No debrief, no medical check, just a silent, escorted walk to his truck. The morning sun was blinding. The drive back to his quiet, tree-lined subdivision in Fayetteville felt like a hallucination. The world was utterly normal. People were mowing their lawns. A mail truck was making its rounds. A golden retriever barked at a passing car. It was terrifyingly mundane. Silas parked in his driveway. He sat in the cab of his Ford F-150 for a long time, staring at the front door. Behind that door was Lily, his 9-year-old anchor, the only piece of his heart that hadn't died when his wife, Sarah, did. He wiped the dried blood off his neck, straightened his jacket, and walked inside. "Dad." Lily came sliding across the hardwood floor in her socks, crashing into his legs. She smelled like maple syrup and the strawberry shampoo Sarah used to buy. Silas dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest. He closed his eyes, burying his face in her shoulder. He held on a second too long, a fraction too tight. "Dad, you're squeezing my ribs," she giggled, squirming back. She looked at his face, her smile faltering slightly. "You look tired, and you smell like burnt fireworks." "Just a long drill. Bug," Silas lied smoothly, forcing a smile. It was the first of 1,000 lies he would tell today. "Who wants pancakes?" For the next 12 hours, Silas played the role of the perfect, exhausted father. They made a mess in the kitchen. They watched a cartoon movie about dragons. They built a fort out of sofa cushions. But beneath the laughter, Silas was drowning. Every time he looked out the living room window, he saw a black SUV parked down the street. Every time the floorboards creaked, his hand twitched toward the concealed holster he had strapped to his ankle. He was bringing the war into his living room. By simply existing, by knowing about Mara Thorne and Aegis Zero, he had painted a target on the back of his own child. Night fell. The shadows in the house stretched long and heavy. It was 8:30 p.m. Bedtime. Silas carried Lily up the stairs, tucked her under her star-patterned quilt, and grabbed Mr. Hops, the stuffed rabbit missing its left ear. He went to tuck the rabbit under her pillow, just like he did every night. His hand brushed against something cold, something hard. Silas froze. His blood turned to Freon. Carefully, so as not to wake the half-asleep child, he slid his hand fully under the pillow. His fingers closed around a stiff, plastic rectangle. He pulled it out. It was a matte black keycard. Embossed in the center was the silver emblem of an eclipsed sun. It was the same card Mara Thorne had thrown on the steel table in Vault 9. But there was something else. Written in silver Sharpie on the back of the card was a standard 10-digit phone number. They had been inside his house, while he was making pancakes, while he was watching cartoons. Someone from Aegis Zero had picked the locks, bypassed the alarm, walked up the stairs, and stood right next to his sleeping daughter. They could have killed her in a heartbeat. Instead, they left an invitation. "We can touch her whenever we want." The card screamed in silence. Silas stood up, his vision tunneled. The sheer, white-hot fury that spiked in his chest was enough to level a city block. He walked out of Lily's room, leaving the door cracked open just enough to let the hallway light in. He went into his own bedroom, locked the door, and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed the number on the back of the black card. It rang once. "Captain Vance," a voice answered. It wasn't Mara. It was a man's voice, cultured, smooth, carrying the patrician cadence of old money and absolute authority. "I hope Lily enjoyed the pancakes." Silas gripped the phone so hard the plastic casing groaned. "If you ever come near her again, I will hunt you down. I don't care how many guards you have. I don't care what black site you hide in. I will rip your throat out with my bare hands." "I believe you, Silas." The voice said calmly. But you misunderstand. We didn't leave the card to threaten your daughter. We left it to show you how vulnerable she is. The world is a very dangerous place. Captain, there are wolves at the door. We are offering you a chance to become the door. Who are you? Silas demanded. My name is Director Julian Vane. I am the architect of Aegis Zero. We've been watching you. Silas, you have a unique psychological profile. You are highly lethal, yet remarkably disciplined. You have nothing left to lose. Except the child sleeping in the next room. And right now, your existence in the light makes her a target for the people cleaning up last night's mess. So what? Silas spat. I come work for you? I become a ghost, and you leave her alone? More than that, Vane said softly. You come work for us. And she becomes untouchable. We will fund an anonymous trust in her name. She will go to the best schools. She will have a security detail shadowing her from a mile away for the rest of her life. She will never know want. And she will never know danger. But you will cease to exist. Silas Vance will die tonight. You will walk away, and you will never look back. That is the price of her safety. Silas looked at the wall separating his room from Lily's. He thought of the erasers with their suppressed rifles. He thought of the suits in the interrogation room. Vane was right. Silas couldn't protect her by staying. If he stayed, he was just a guy with a handgun against an empire of shadows. But if he left, if he became the monster in the dark, she got to live in the light. Where do I go? Silas whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. There is a black sedan idling 3 blocks east of your subdivision. You have 20 minutes. Bring nothing. The line went dead. Silas lowered the phone. The silence in the house was deafening. He walked into the hallway. He opened Lily's door and stepped quietly into her room. She was fast asleep, her breathing slow and rhythmic, one arm thrown over Mr. Hopp's. Silas knelt by her bed. The tears he hadn't shed when his wife died finally broke, hot and silent, tracking down his weathered cheeks. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently stroked her hair. I'm sorry, Bug, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. He unclasped his silver dog tags from his neck, the tags he had worn for 15 years. Through sand, blood, and fire, he laid them softly on the nightstand next to her lamp. It was the only piece of him she would ever have left. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't write a note. A note would only leave a trail. Silas Vance walked down the stairs, opened his front door, and stepped out into the cool North Carolina night. He didn't look back at the house. He knew if he looked back, his resolve would shatter, and he would condemn his daughter to death just to hold her one more time. He walked east, the streetlights buzzing faintly overhead. With every step, Captain Silas Vance died a little more. And in the dark, approaching the idling black sedan at the edge of the world, the ghost was born. The flight took 14 hours. And Silas Vance didn't see the sun once. He sat in the belly of a windowless C-130 Hercules, strapped to a webbed nylon seat. The drone of the turboprop engines was a relentless, vibrating hum that rattled his teeth. No one spoke to him. The 2 Aegis operatives who had picked him up in North Carolina sat across the cargo bay, their faces hidden behind black balaclavas, staring straight ahead like decommissioned mannequins. When the rear ramp finally lowered, it wasn't into a hangar. It was into a blinding, sub-zero whiteout. The wind hit Silas like a physical blow, carrying ice crystals that sliced at any exposed skin. They had landed on a frozen runway carved directly into the jagged teeth of a mountain range. There were no trees, no wildlife, no horizon, just rock, ice, and an endless expanse of absolute nothingness. Welcome to Alaska, Silas, one of the operatives said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Welcome to the Grey Room. Silas was marched toward a monolithic concrete bunker built straight into the side of a glacier. It had no windows, no visible communication arrays, no markings. It looked less like a military installation and more like a tomb. The moment the heavy steel doors sealed shut behind him, cutting off the shriek of the Arctic wind, Silas Vance officially ceased to exist. They didn't just take his clothes, they took his identity. He was stripped, scrubbed down with harsh antibacterial soap in a freezing shower, and handed a set of featureless, charcoal-gray tactical fatigues. No name tapes, No rank insignia, just a Velcro patch on his right shoulder bearing a single number. Candidate 7. For the first 3 days, nobody threw a punch. Nobody handed him a weapon. He was locked in a 10 by 10 concrete cell with a steel cot, a toilet, and a single, unblinking fluorescent light that never turned off. Aegis Zero didn't need to teach Silas how to shoot. The United States Army had already spent millions of dollars turning him into a master of ballistics and close-quarters combat. Aegis needed to teach him something far more difficult. They needed to teach him how to live with the shot. They called it moral erosion. On the 4th day, the steel door hissed open. Silas, sleep-deprived and operating on a diet of tasteless nutrient paste, stood up, his muscles coiled. Standing in the doorway was Mara Thorne. She looked different than she had in Vault 9. The tactical jacket was gone, replaced by the same featureless gray fatigues Silas wore. Her black hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. But it was her eyes that had truly changed. In North Carolina, there had been a flicker of empathy, a quiet understanding of his grief. Here, in the belly of the gray room, her eyes were dead. They were the eyes of a shark cruising deep water. "You look tired, Candidate 7, she said, her voice echoing in the sterile hallway. "Where am I, Mara?" Silas asked, his voice rough. "Mara doesn't work here," she replied instantly. "My designation is Wraith. I am your shadow instructor. And for the next 6 weeks, I am your god. Follow me." She led him out of the cell block and down a labyrinth of subterranean corridors. The facility was massive, a subterranean hive of glass, steel, and humming servers. Men and women in gray moved past them with terrifying, silent purpose. No one made eye contact. No one smiled. Wraith led Silas into a massive, cavernous chamber. It looked like a movie set, a highly detailed, full-scale replica of a bustling Middle Eastern marketplace, complete with dirt streets, fruit stands, and gutted vehicles. But it wasn't a set. It was a hyper-realistic simulator. "Pick it up," Wraith said, pointing to a steel table at the edge of the staging area. Resting on the table was a customized, suppressed Mk-11 sniper rifle. Silas picked it up instinctively. The weight of it grounded him. He checked the action, popped the magazine to verify the rounds, and slid it back into place with a satisfying click. Muscle memory. "The military taught you rules of engagement," Wraith said, pacing slowly behind him. "They taught you that you only pull the trigger when fired upon. They taught you to identify combatants versus non-combatants. They gave you a moral compass." She stopped right by his ear. Her breath was cold. "A moral compass is a liability in our line of work. It makes you hesitate. And hesitation gets cities burned to the ground. Today, we break your compass." Wraith tapped a tablet in her hand. Suddenly, the cavernous room came to life. Holographic projectors and advanced animatronics populated the marketplace. The air filled with the piped-in sounds of a busy bazaar, people shouting, music playing, a dog barking. It was incredibly, terrifyingly immersive. "Your target is the suicide bomber in the center of the market." Wraith's voice came through an earpiece Silas had been given. "He is wearing a vest wired with a dispersed biological agent. If he detonates, the agent will catch the jet stream and wipe out a population center of 4 million people. You are on Overwatch. You have 15 seconds before he reaches the detonation point." Silas brought the heavy Mk-11 to his shoulder. He peered through the high-powered optic, scanning the holographic crowd. He found the target standing by a fruit cart. Silas's breath hitched in his throat. His finger, resting lightly on the trigger guard, went rigid. The target wasn't a hardened terrorist. It wasn't a fanatic. It was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 12. The child was crying, shivering in an oversized jacket that bulged unnaturally around his torso. In his trembling hand, he held a dead man's switch. "Lily is 9. Silas's brain screamed. "Target acquired," Silas said, his voice shaking. "Wraith, it's a kid. He's a child. He is a delivery system for a bioweapon." Wraith's voice buzzed in his ear, flat and devoid of any human warmth. 10 seconds. "He's crying. He's been forced to do this. There are 50 innocent civilians within the blast radius. If I shoot him, the dead man's switch triggers the vest anyway. If he detonates the vest inside the crowd, The biological agent is contained by the localized heat in the bodies of the civilians. The 50 people in the market die. But the bioweapon burns up. The 4 million people in the city live. 5 seconds. 7. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat stung his eyes. Through the scope, the boy looked directly at him, a trick of the simulation. But it felt agonizingly real. The boy was terrified. I can't shoot a kid. I'm a father. 3 seconds. Wraith said. Her voice didn't rise. It was absolute ice. Shoot the child. Candidate 7. Or let 4 million burn. Silas closed his eyes. He saw Lily's face. He saw the star-patterned quilt. He remembered the promise Director Vane made. She will go to the best schools. She will never know danger. 2. Silas opened his eyes. He exhaled, letting the breath carry away the last remnants of Captain Silas Vance. He squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle kicked against his shoulder. Through the scope, the holographic boy's chest exploded in a mist of red pixels. The dead man's switch dropped. A simulated explosion rocked the cavern. Deafening audio of a blast, followed immediately by the horrific, agonizing screams of the 50 civilians caught in the crossfire. Women, children, men, burning alive in the digital fire. The simulation abruptly shut off. The lights flickered back to standard fluorescence. The marketplace was empty. Silas lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the weapon. He stumbled back, bracing his hand against the concrete wall, and vomited dry bile onto the floor. He couldn't breathe. The phantom screams were still ringing in his right ear. He had just murdered a child to burn 50 innocent people alive. It was fake, but the choice he made inside his own mind was entirely real. Wraith walked over to him. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a platitude. She looked down at him, her gray eyes studying the broken pieces of a man trying to put himself back together. You're sick because you think you just did something evil, Wraith said softly, her voice echoing in the massive, quiet room. You are clinging to the luxury of a clean conscience. A clean conscience is a selfish thing, Silas. It means you would rather let 4 million people die just so you can sleep well at night. Silas wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. Looking up at her, he was a boy. He was a math equation. Wraith corrected, her tone completely devoid of mercy. And you balanced the equation. You traded 51 lives for 4 million. That is what Aegis Zero does. We don't get to keep our souls, Silas. We trade them, piece by piece, so the rest of the world gets to keep theirs. She reached down, picked up the Mk11 from the floor, and cleared the chamber with a sharp, mechanical snap. You hesitated for 12 seconds today, Wraith said, turning her back on him. Tomorrow, you will do it in 5. And by the end of this month, you won't hesitate at all. Because if you do, I will put a bullet in your head myself to save you the misery of watching your daughter's world burn. She walked away, her boots echoing rhythmically against the concrete, leaving Silas alone in the vast, empty room. He sat on the floor, staring at his hands. They didn't feel like his hands anymore. The meat grinder had done its job. The erosion had begun. Captain Silas Vance was dead, and whatever was growing in his place was hungry for the dark. The Sonora Desert didn't just burn you, it baked the humanity out of you. The heat radiating off the jagged limestone ridge was a physical weight, pressing down like an anvil. The air was so dry it cracked the inside of your throat with every breath. It had been 6 months since Silas Vance walked into the freezing hell of the Grey Room. 6 months of psychological dismantling. 6 months of learning how to reduce human lives to windage, elevation, and atmospheric drag. Today was the final exam. Silas lay prone on a flat outcropping of rock, his body completely still beneath a therm-optic ghillie suit that rendered him invisible to both the naked eye and thermal imaging. Beneath him rested the Chaitak M200 intervention, its long, fluted barrel wrapped in desert camo webbing, baking in the 110-degree sun. Lying 2 feet to his left, her eye pressed against a high-powered spotting scope, was Wraith. Target is moving to the courtyard, Wraith whispered. Her voice barely disturbed the dead, heavy air. Silas didn't blink. His right eye was locked into the Schmidt and Bender optic. Through the glass, distorted slightly by the shimmering heat mirage, was a heavily fortified villa 2.5 kilometers away. 2,500 meters, more than a mile and a half of empty, unforgiving desert separated the muzzle of his rifle from the beating heart of his target. "I have him," Silas said quietly, his voice raspy from dehydration. The man walking out onto the terracotta patio of the villa was Alejandro Vargas. To the DIA, Vargas was a phantom, a ruthless cartel boss who controlled the human trafficking routes from Sonora to Arizona. He was untouchable, protected by an army of sicarios and a fortress built into the side of a canyon. But Aegis Zero knew the truth. Alejandro Vargas wasn't cartel. He was a rogue CIA field officer. 5 years ago, the agency had sent Vargas deep undercover to dismantle the cartel from the inside. Instead, Vargas realized the cartel paid better. He went native. Now, he was using highly classified U.S. intelligence and stolen black market weapons to turn the Mexican border into a war zone, selling out American agents and profiting off the slaughter. The military couldn't touch him without causing an international incident. The CIA couldn't touch him without admitting they had created a monster. So, they called the people who didn't exist. They called Aegis Zero. Distance: 2,734 yards. Wraith murmured, her voice falling into the hypnotic, clinical cadence of a spotter. Wind is full value. Coming right to left. 9 knots at the muzzle. But look at the dust kicking up in the valley. 7. You've got a cross current at the halfway mark. Call it 12 knots. Shifting. Copy. Silas breathed. His hands moved over the rifle's turrets, dialing in the minute adjustments. Click, click, click. Temperature is 111 degrees. Humidity is 7%. Barometric pressure is 29.82 inches. Wraith continued. The air is thin. Silas, the bullet is going to fly fast. Dial down your elevation by a quarter MOA. Don't forget the Earth's rotation. Vargas is facing east. The planet is pulling him away from you. Silas made the final adjustments. His thumb pushed the safety forward. Click. Target has stopped moving, Wraith said. He is sitting at the patio table, lighting a cigar. 2 armed guards standing 10 feet behind him. You have a clear lane. Silas stared through the scope. At this magnification, he could see the heavy gold watch on Vargas's wrist. He could see the smoke drifting lazily from the tip of the cigar. He could see the face of a man who believed he was a king. Completely insulated by money, concrete, and blood. Silas had killed men before. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, but that was combat. That was kinetic, chaotic, kill or be killed survival. This was different. This was premeditated. This was an execution from the shadows. Vargas didn't know he was in a fight. He was just a man enjoying a cigar in the sun. He is a math equation. Wraith's voice echoed in his memory. Balance the equation. If Vargas lived, more American agents would be sold out. More innocent people would be trafficked across the border in suffocating semi-trucks. If Vargas died, the route collapsed. The equation balanced. Send it when ready, Wraith whispered. Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He pictured Lily's face. He pictured the star-patterned quilt. This is the price of her safety. He opened his eyes. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the burning desert air. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath drain out of him. As he reached the natural pause at the bottom of his breath, the moment of perfect, absolute stillness where the human body is essentially dead, his finger applied exactly 3 pounds of pressure to the curved steel trigger. Crack. The rifle surged against his shoulder. A violent, controlled explosion of kinetic energy. A massive plume of dust kicked up from the muzzle brake, instantly swept away by the wind. Through the scope, the violence of the recoil settled, and Silas watched the flight of the bullet. Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. It was a phenomenon snipers called the long second. The heavy, 419-grain solid copper bullet left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It tore through the superheated air, leaving a visible, swirling vapor trail in its wake, a perfect, deadly corkscrew cutting through the mirage. It flew for 1 second, slicing through the crosswinds in the valley, spinning flawlessly, the aerodynamics fighting the relentless pull of gravity. 2 seconds. It crested the apex of its parabolic arc, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Before beginning its steep, calculated descent. 3 seconds. The sound of the gunshot was still miles away from the villa. Vargas was still holding the cigar to his lips, utterly oblivious to the piece of supersonic metal screaming out of the sky. 3.4 seconds. The bullet struck. Through the optic, Silas watched the violent, devastating transfer of energy. Alejandro Vargas's chest caved inward as the massive round struck him dead center. He was thrown backward out of his patio chair with the force of a car crash, his body slamming into the stucco wall behind him. The cigar tumbled to the terracotta tiles. The two armed guards flinched, staring in absolute horror at their boss, who was dead before his body even hit the ground. A second later, the thunderous boom of the gunshot finally echoed through the canyon, washing over the villa like a physical wave. Impact, Wraith said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. Center mass. Target is neutralized. Clean kill. 7. Silas didn't speak. He racked the bolt, ejecting the smoking brass casing onto the baking rock, and closed the action on an empty chamber. He engaged the safety. He had done it. He had made the impossible shot. He had traded a life for a life. Pack it up, Wraith ordered, already breaking down her spotting scope. Cartel QRF will be swarming that villa in 2 minutes. We need to be at the extraction point in 10. They moved like ghosts, breaking down the gear, sweeping their firing position for brass or fibers, and disappearing into the jagged rocks of the Sonora Desert before the first cartel trucks even tore out of the compound. 12 hours later, the Aegis Zero safe house in Tucson, Arizona, was a sterile, mid-century modern home that smelled faintly of ozone and lemon bleach. It was a place designed for ghosts to rest before disappearing again. Silas stood in the master bathroom. The only sound was the hum of the central air conditioning and the rush of cold water pouring from the stainless steel faucet. He leaned over the sink, splashing the freezing water onto his face, washing away the desert grit, the sweat, and the smell of gun oil. He gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, his knuckles turning white, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow void in his chest. He slowly looked up at the mirror. He expected to see Captain Silas Vance. He expected to see a hero. A man who had just saved countless lives by eliminating a monster. A father who had secured his daughter's future. But that wasn't who was looking back at him. The man in the mirror had dark, sunken eyes. The lines around his mouth were deeper, carved out by a heavy, invisible chisel. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying indifference. For a terrifying, fleeting second, the face in the mirror shifted. It wasn't his reflection. It was Alejandro Vargas, staring back at him with dead, vacant eyes. Then it shifted again, and he saw the face of the crying 12-year-old boy from the Alaska simulation. Silas blinked hard, his heart slamming against his ribs. The faces vanished. It was just him again. But the truth settled over him like a suffocating shroud. He hadn't just killed a man today. He had killed the last remaining piece of his own soul. He had looked through a piece of glass and played God from a mile and a half away. And the worst part, the part that made him want to shatter the mirror with his bare hands, was that it had felt easy. The meat grinder had worked. Silas Vance was gone. Wraith appeared in the doorway of the bathroom. She held a glass of amber bourbon in her hand. She didn't look at him, she looked at his reflection in the mirror. "The first one is the loudest," she said softly, taking a sip of the liquor. "They scream in your head for a while. You look in the mirror and you see their faces. You wonder if you made a mistake. You wonder if there was another way." Silas stared at her reflection. "Does it ever stop?" Wraith lowered the glass. Her gray eyes met his in the mirror, carrying the crushing weight of 100 kills, 100 ghosts, 100 quiet assassinations that kept the world spinning. "No," Wraith said, her voice a hollow whisper. "It doesn't stop, but eventually, you stop caring. And that, Silas, is when you become a true monster. Welcome to the dark." She turned and walked out, leaving Silas alone with his reflection. He reached up and turned off the bathroom light, plunging the room into absolute blackness. He preferred it this way. In the dark, he didn't have to look at what he had become. In the dark, He was just a weapon. And weapons don't feel pain. 7 years is a long time to hold your breath. For Captain Silas Vance, those 7 years were measured not in birthdays, holidays, or passing seasons, but in brass casings and windage adjustments. The meat grinder hadn't just changed him, it had forged him. He was no longer Silas Vance. To the shadowed echelons of Aegis Zero, he was simply Cross, a phantom, a rumor whispered among global intelligence agencies. He was the man you called when a target was insulated by 1,000 guards, concrete bunkers, and diplomatic immunity. The montage of his life became a blur of hotel rooms that all smelled like industrial bleach, and rooftops that all felt like graveyards. 22. A rogue munitions dealer in a crowded plaza in Prague. 47. A corrupt intelligence director stepping off a yacht in Monaco. 61. A warlord heavily guarded in a mountain compound in the Hindu Kush. The faces change, the wind speeds changed, but the math was always the same. Balance the equation, pull the trigger, become the void. By his 7th year, Silas had 72 confirmed, unsanctioned kills. 72 times he had played God from a mile away. His heart no longer spiked when he squeezed the trigger. It simply skipped a beat and settled back into a cold, rhythmic deadness. But even a ghost needs an anchor, lest it drift away completely into the dark. It was 3 o'clock hours in a sterile safe house in Vienna, Austria. The snow outside was falling in thick, silent sheets, blanketing the city in a pristine white that hid the grime beneath. Silas sat at a glass table, illuminated only by the harsh, blue glow of a heavily encrypted Aegis Zero laptop. He typed in a 40-character alphanumeric passcode. He didn't pull up target dossiers or satellite telemetry. He pulled up a secure, one-way surveillance feed. On the screen was a brightly lit high school gymnasium in North Carolina. The bleachers were packed. A banner reading "Happy 16th Birthday, Lily" hung crookedly on the wall. There she was, Lily. She wasn't the little girl with the missing front teeth and the stuffed rabbit anymore. She was a young woman. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jawline. She was laughing, surrounded by friends, holding up the keys to a vintage, restored Mustang. Silas reached out, his calloused, scarred index finger lightly tracing the screen over her smiling face. Director Vane had kept his promise. Lily lived in a fortress of invisible privilege. The trust fund paid for the best private schools. The anonymous benefactor had bought the Mustang. Aegis operatives, disguised as neighborhood watchmen and substitute teachers, ensured no harm ever came within 10 miles of her. She was safe. She was happy. She was entirely fatherless. Silas watched the video loop for the 5th time. His chest ached with a physical, crushing gravity. He had traded his soul, his name, and his right to hold her, just so she could smile like that. He closed the laptop. The screen went black, and once again, he was just a killer sitting alone in the dark. The sharp beep of his secure comms unit shattered the silence. Cross. Director Vane's voice crackled through the encrypted line, smooth and immaculately calm. Pack your gear. We have a situation in St. Petersburg. And we have a problem with Wraith. Silas's jaw tightened. What kind of problem? The kind that requires your immediate oversight. Vane replied. She has the lead on this op. You are her spotter, but I need you to watch her closely. Silas. A weapon is only useful if it fires in the right direction. 12 hours later, Silas was lying on the freezing, snow-covered roof of a Soviet-era apartment block in St. Petersburg. The wind coming off the Neva River was a razor blade, slicing through their thermal gear. Beside him lay Mara Thorne. She looked skeletal. The years of carrying the weight of the dark had hollowed her out. Her pale gray eyes, once sharp and calculating, were sunken and fractured. Her hands, the hands that could assemble a sniper rifle in the pitch black, trembled slightly as they gripped the stock of the Chetak M200. Silas was glued to the spotting scope. Target vehicle is approaching the courtyard. 2 black SUVs. The mark is in the second vehicle. Russian FSB general. Selling nerve gas to a proxy terror cell. Distance is 1,800 yards. Wind is brutal. Mara, quartering toward us at 18 knots. Mara didn't respond. She was staring through her optic. her breathing ragged and shallow. "Mara?" Silas prompted, adjusting his focus knob. "Windage is left 4.2 mils. Elevation is." "He's looking right at me," Mara whispered. Her voice was trembling. It was the voice of a terrified child. Silas frowned, his eye pressed to the glass. The target, the Russian general, was stepping out of the SUV, surrounded by bodyguards. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his phone. Negative. Wraith. Target is completely unaware. He's static by the vehicle door. You have a 5-second window before he enters the bunker. "Why is he crying?" Mara asked, a tear slipping down her frozen cheek, freezing almost instantly against her collar. "He's just a boy, Silas. He has a dead man's switch." Silas's blood ran cold. Mara wasn't looking at the Russian general. Her mind had completely fractured. The psychological dam had finally broken, flooding her optic nerve with the ghosts of her past. She was hallucinating the 12-year-old suicide bomber from the simulator in Alaska. The guilt she had suppressed for over a decade was bleeding into her reality. "Mara, listen to me," Silas said urgently, keeping his voice low but sharp. "That is not a child. It is the general. He is carrying nerve gas codes. Pull your head away from the scope. Look at me. I can't balance the equation anymore." Mara sobbed, her finger twitching erratically against the trigger guard. "There's too much blood on the scale. Silas, it's spilling over. The kid, he's just a kid." 3 seconds. "Wraith, he's moving." Mara froze completely. The weapon that never missed was paralyzed by the weight of the dead. Silas didn't hesitate. He knew if they failed this mission, Vane would have them both executed. He shoved Mara's shoulder hard, rolling her away from the rifle. In one fluid, seamless motion, Silas slid behind the Chetak. He didn't have time to recheck the wind. He didn't have time to calculate the barometric drop. He relied purely on the terrifying, inhuman instinct that Aegis Zero had drilled into his cortex. He found the general in the crosshairs just as the man reached for the bunker door. Silas exhaled. The world went silent. Crack. The rifle roared, kicking up a cloud of snow from the rooftop. Through the scope, Silas watched the supersonic round punch through the freezing Russian air. 1.8 seconds. The round struck the general in the base of the neck, dropping him instantly onto the cobblestones before he could even touch the door handle. "Target neutralized," Silas said automatically, his voice a dead monotone. He looked over at Mara. She was curled into a fetal position on the snowy roof, her hands pressed over her ears, weeping uncontrollably. The ghost of Aegis Zero, the most lethal assassin the covert world had ever known, was entirely, irrevocably broken. Silas reached over and pulled her into his chest, shielding her from the biting wind as the sirens began to wail in the distance. "I've got you," Silas whispered, his own heart breaking as he held the woman who had taught him how to survive the dark. "I've got you, Mara." The debrief with Director Vane was conducted via a secure satellite uplink in the cargo hold of an Aegis extraction plane over the Atlantic. Vane's face appeared on the monitor, crisp, unreadable, and devoid of any human empathy. "A messy extraction. Cross," Vane noted, adjusting his cuffs, "but the target is eliminated. That makes 73 for you. An exemplary record. You are officially our primary asset." "Wraith needs help, Vane," Silas said, standing rigid before the screen. "She's suffering from severe dissociative trauma. The psychological conditioning broke. She needs psychiatric care and a permanent stand-down order." Vane smiled. It was a terrifying expression, like a razor blade hidden in an apple. "Aegis Zero doesn't have a pension plan, Silas," Vane said softly. "We don't have a Veterans Affairs hospital. When a tool rusts, we do not polish it. We discard it. Mara Thorne is a liability. She knows the locations of our black sites. She knows the names of our architects. We cannot simply let her walk into a civilian therapist's office and start talking about phantom sniper shots." Silas felt his hand drift instinctively toward the sidearm holstered at his hip. "What are you saying, Julian?" "I am saying that Mara Thorne's watch has ended," Vane replied smoothly. "When you land at the staging facility in Cyprus, you will hand her over to our medical division. They will initiate the Oblivion Protocol." Silas's breath hitched. The Oblivion Protocol. It was a myth he had heard whispered in the gray room. A chemical and neurological procedure that violently scoured the brain's hippocampus. It erased years of memory, reducing an operative to a blank slate. But the trauma of the wipe often left the subject functionally lobotomized. "You're going to erase her mind," Silas growled. "You'll destroy whatever is left of her." "I am going to secure my agency," Vane corrected. "And you are going to let it happen, Silas. Because if you intervene, if you show even a fraction of the weakness she displayed today, I will pull the funding for Lily's trust. I will remove the security detail. And I will let the wolves have her." The screen went black. Silas stood in the vibrating cargo hold of the plane. He looked through the small reinforced window into the medical bay. Mara was strapped to a gurney, heavily sedated, staring blankly at the ceiling. She had sacrificed her entire life, her entire soul, to keep the world safe. And her reward was going to be total, agonizing erasure. Silas looked at his hands. 73 ghosts rested on his fingers. He had become the perfect weapon. But as he looked at Mara, and remembered the threat Vane had just made against his daughter, Captain Silas Vance realized something Director Vane had overlooked. If you forge a man into the perfect weapon, you'd better be absolutely certain he never points it back at you. The dark was calling, but this time, Silas wasn't going to shoot the target Vane pointed him at. This time, the ghost was going to hunt the architect. The Al-Mara Governorate in eastern Yemen is not a place where things grow. It is a place where things go to turn into dust. The mountains are jagged, rusted iron cutting into a sky so bright it burns the retinas. It was exactly 72 hours since the snowy rooftop in St. Petersburg. Silas Vance lay on his stomach on a blistering ledge of shale, staring down into a sprawling, ancient valley. Beside him lay Mara Thorne. Silas had bought her a stay of execution when Director Vane ordered Mara to be sent to Cyprus for the Oblivion Protocol. Silas had played his only card. Vane wanted a high-valued target eliminated in Yemen. The distance was 4,200 meters, 2.6 miles, a world record, a mathematical impossibility. Silas had told Vane, "I can pull the trigger, Julian, but nobody on this earth can read the wind at 2.5 miles except Wraith. I need her in the dirt beside me, or you can find another triggerman." Vane had agreed, but he hadn't sent them alone. 60 yards behind their sniper hide, waiting in the shadow of a crumbling stone ruin, was a 6-man extraction team. Erasers, fully armored, heavily armed, and entirely loyal to Vane. They weren't there to carry Silas's gear. They were there to ensure the shot was taken, and to put a bullet in the back of Mara's head the moment the brass hit the dirt. Silas knew it. Mara knew it. Distance: 4,210 meters. Mara whispered. Her voice was thin, raspy from the cocktail of amphetamines and stabilizing suppressants Aegis Medical had pumped into her to keep the hallucinations at bay. But she was lucid. For this one, final moment, the Wraith was back. "Target convoy is approaching the valley floor," Mara continued, her eye locked onto the massive optics of her spotting scope. 3 armored land cruisers. They're stopping at the oasis ruin. Wind is a nightmare. Silas, you've got a thermal updraft coming off the valley floor, shifting to a cross breeze at 2,000 meters, and a tailwind at the target zone. It's a 3-stage atmospheric transit. Silas didn't blink. The Chetak M200 intervention felt heavy against his shoulder. His eye was pressed to the Schmidt and Bender optic. "Give me the math, Mara." "Hold left 12.5 mils. Dial elevation to absolute maximum. The bullet flight time is going to be 9.8 seconds. Silas, at this distance, the Magnus effect is going to spin the bullet upward. Aim for his belt buckle if you want to hit his chest." "Copy." Silas breathed. "Target is exiting the center vehicle," Mara said. Through the scope, the heat mirage warped the image, making the figures look like they were swimming underwater. Silas watched the man step out of the armored SUV. According to Director Vane's dossier, the target was Khalid al-Zafir, a ghost cell terrorist leader who had acquired weapons-grade sarin gas and was meeting a buyer to orchestrate a strike on a European capital. "I have him," Silas said. His finger hovered over the trigger. "Wait," Mara whispered. The urgency in her voice broke the clinical rhythm of the spotter. Silas kept his eye on the scope but paused his breathing cycle. What is it? Look at the man shaking his hand, Mara said, her voice tightening. Look at the briefcase. Look at the lapel pin on the target. Silas adjusted his magnification, pushing the optic to its absolute limit. Through the shimmering heat, the details swam into focus. The man shaking the target's hand was wearing a blue UN peacekeeping beret. The target wasn't wearing a tactical vest or traditional militia garb. He was wearing a tailored suit. And on his lapel was a gold pin of a dove. That's not Al-Zafir, Mara breathed, the horror dawning on her in real time. Silas, that's Tariq Ibrahim. He's an Iranian peace negotiator. He's here to sign a back-channel ceasefire agreement that would end the proxy war in the Gulf. Silas felt the blood freeze in his veins despite the 115-degree heat. Vane lied to us. Mara's voice trembled. There is no sarin gas. If you pull that trigger, you aren't stopping a terror attack. You're assassinating a peacemaker. You're going to destabilize the entire Middle East. Aegis Zero isn't preventing a war. Silas, they're starting one. The terrifying truth snapped into place. Aegis Zero didn't exist to protect the world. It existed to manage it. A lasting peace in the Middle East would cost the military-industrial complex hundreds of billions of dollars in defense contracts. Vane wasn't a guardian. He was a war profiteer operating in the absolute dark, using ghosts like Silas and Mara to manipulate global history. Crunch. Heavy boots stepped onto the shale directly behind them. Silas didn't have to look back to know that the leader of the eraser team had closed the distance. The man was standing 10 feet away, a suppressed Mk-18 carbine leveled at Silas's spine. Take the shot. Cross. The digitally altered voice buzzed through the eraser's comms mask. The window is closing. Silas's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against the hot stone. If he didn't pull the trigger, the eraser would shoot him and Mara dead on the cliff. And if Silas died, Lily's protection disappeared. Vane would feed a 16-year-old girl to the wolves just to tie up a loose end. But if he pulled the trigger, he would murder an innocent man, plunge an entire hemisphere into a bloody, decade-long war, and solidify his transformation into the monster Vane wanted him to be. And the erasers would likely execute Mara anyway. I am the door, Vane had told him all those years ago. You will keep the wolves at bay. Silas looked through the scope. Tariq Ibrahim was smiling, opening the briefcase to hand over the treaty documents. Cross. Shoot him. Now, the eraser commanded, racking the bolt of his carbine. Wind is shifting. Silas lied smoothly, his voice dead and emotionless. Give me 3 seconds. 3. The eraser counted down. Silas shifted his right hand slightly on the grip of the massive sniper rifle. 2. Silas didn't look at Mara, but he tapped the side of her boot with his heel, a 2-tap tactical signal they had developed years ago. Execute. 1. Silas Vance didn't pull the trigger. Instead, utilizing the incredible core strength forged in the icy hell of Alaska, Silas planted his elbows, pivoted his entire torso, and swung the massive, 40-pound Chaitak rifle 180 degrees. He didn't bother using the optic. He fired from the hip. Boom. The muzzle of the .408 sniper rifle was less than 6 feet from the eraser leader's chest. The concussive blast of the heavy round leaving the barrel at 3,000 feet per second shattered the silence of the Yemeni mountains like a thunderbolt. The massive copper-solid bullet hit the eraser's level 4 ceramic chest plate and didn't just penetrate it, it pulverized it. The man was lifted off his feet and thrown backward through the air. His chest completely caved in, crashing into the jagged rocks. Before the deafening echo of the sniper shot had even faded, Mara was moving. The heavy medication in her system was burned away by a sudden, massive spike of pure adrenaline. She dropped the spotting scope, rolled onto her back, and drew her suppressed MP7 from her thigh holster in a blur of black tactical fabric. The remaining 5 erasers, positioned by the crumbling ruins 60 yards away, opened fire. Chips of shale and limestone exploded all around Silas and Mara. Move, Silas roared, dropping the heavy, cumbersome sniper rifle. He drew his twin SIG M17s, providing covering fire. Crack, 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 crack. Mara didn't dive for cover. She vaulted over a low stone wall, moving with the terrifying, predatory grace that had earned her the name Wraith. She ran laterally across the cliff face, drawing the eraser's fire away from Silas. Peefed, peefed, peefed. Her suppressed MP7 spat 4.6 mm armor-piercing rounds. An eraser tracking her with his rifle took 2 rounds through the narrow visor of his helmet. He dropped instantly. 4 left. Silas surged to his feet, sprinting toward a rusted outcropping of iron ore. Bullets snapped the air inches from his face, cracking like miniature bullwhips. He slid behind the rock on his knees, popping out the left side. He fired 3 rounds, catching an advancing eraser in the exposed joint of his shoulder armor. The man spun, crying out, and Mara finished him with a ruthlessly efficient double tap to the back of the head. 3 left. They were falling back, realizing they weren't fighting 2 exhausted snipers. They were fighting the 2 deadliest assassins the agency had ever created. The erasers threw a fragmentation grenade. Frag! Silas yelled. Mara dove over the lip of the cliff, sliding down a steep embankment of loose scree just as the grenade detonated. The explosion threw a shower of razor-sharp shrapnel and rock over Silas's head. His left ear popped, blood trickling down his neck. Through the dust and smoke, the 3 remaining erasers pushed forward in a tight wedge formation, sweeping their rifles. They thought they had the high ground. But Silas Vance wasn't a ghost just because he could shoot from a mile away. He was a ghost because he knew how to disappear. While the erasers pushed the smoke, Silas had crawled through a narrow fissure in the rock formation, flanking them entirely. He stood up behind them, the desert sun blindingly bright at his back. He didn't say a word. He raised his M17s. Crack, crack, crack. 2 erasers went down, shot cleanly through the backs of their knees, bypassing their heavy body armor. As they collapsed, screaming, Silas stepped forward and put a single round into the base of each of their skulls. The final eraser spun around, leveling his carbine. Before he could pull the trigger, Mara crested the embankment behind him, grabbed the collar of his heavy tactical vest, pulled him backward, and drove her combat knife up through the soft tissue under his chin. The man gurgled, dropped his rifle, and slumped to the dust. Silence rushed back into the Yemeni mountains, broken only by the sound of hot brass clinking against the rocks and the heavy, ragged breathing of 2 ghosts. Silas stood among the 6 dead men. His uniform was torn, his cheek bleeding from a rock splinter. He looked down at the valley. Through the haze, he could see the armored SUVs frantically pulling away from the oasis. The gunshot had spooked the detail. Tariq Ibrahim was alive. The proxy war would end. Mara stood up, pulling her knife free and wiping it on the leg of a dead eraser. She looked at Silas. The fractured, broken look in her eyes from St. Petersburg was gone. It had been replaced by cold, terrible clarity. "We just declared war on Aegis Zero," Mara said, her voice eerily calm. "Vane will burn the world to the ground to find us." Silas holstered his weapons. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out the heavy, encrypted satellite phone Vane had given him. The screen illuminated. Incoming call. Director Vane. Vane's satellite telemetry would have already registered the vitals of his eraser team flatlining. He knew what had happened. Silas answered the call, bringing the heavy phone to his bloodied ear. "You made a mistake, Silas." Vane's voice drifted over the line, devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "You let a misguided sense of morality override your primary directive. I told you what would happen if you failed me. The security detail in North Carolina has been withdrawn. The wolves are off the leash. Lily is no longer under Aegis protection." Silas looked out over the vast, burning desert. His heart didn't race. He felt a profound, chilling stillness settle into his bones. The erosion was complete, but it hadn't turned him into Vane's monster. It had turned him into Vane's executioner. "You listen to me, Julian," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute certainty of a man who has nothing left to fear. "You think you control the dark because you built the walls, but you forgot who you put inside them. You're 2 burned operatives with no extraction and no resources." Vane countered smoothly. "You're ghosts, and ghosts cannot fight an empire. We aren't going to fight your empire." "Vane," Silas replied. He looked at Mara, who nodded once. We're going to burn it to the ground. If one hair on my daughter's head is touched, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle everything you have ever built. And I will put a bullet in the head of everyone who tries to stop me. Start running, Julian, because the ghosts are coming home. Silas crushed the satellite phone under the heel of his combat boot, shattering the screen and severing the connection. He looked at Mara. They were stranded in Yemen, hunted by the most powerful covert agency on the planet. And thousands of miles away, a 16-year-old girl was entirely alone. We need to get to North Carolina, Silas said, racking the slide of his pistol. Before they do, Mara picked up an eraser's carbine, checking the magazine. Then let's go hunt an architect. It took 48 hours to cross the globe when you didn't exist. Silas and Mara had traded the burning shale of Yemen for the freezing, oil-stained cargo hold of a black market C-17 Globemaster. They sat in absolute silence among crates of unmarked munitions, wrapped in thermal blankets, the deafening roar of the jet engines vibrating in their teeth. Mara sat cross-legged on the ribbed metal floor. In her lap was a cracked, blood-stained Panasonic toughbook she had stripped from the body of the eraser leader back in the mountains. For 2 days, she had been running a brute force decryption algorithm, her pale hands flying across the keyboard with manic, desperate energy. Without Aegis Zero's medical stabilizers, the fractures in her mind were widening. Silas could see it. Her eyes darted at shadows. Her breathing was shallow, but beneath the psychological collapse, the raw, terrifying genius of the Wraith remained intact. The toughbook let out a sharp, electronic chirp. The encryption broke. Silas, Mara whispered. Her voice barely carried over the engine noise, but the absolute horror in her tone made Silas's blood run cold. Come look at this. Silas unbuckled his harness and knelt beside her in the dim, red emergency lighting of the cargo hold. The screen was flooded with thousands of highly classified Aegis Zero operation logs, financial transfers, and shadow dossiers. It was the architectural blueprint of Julian Vane's empire. I thought we were the shield, Mara said, her finger trembling as she scrolled through the data. I thought we did the terrible things so the rest of the world could sleep. Look at the ledger. Silas, look at the money. Silas read the screen. The numbers were staggering. Billions of dollars in untraceable bearer bonds, routed through offshore shell corporations linked directly to the world's largest defense contractors. The Juarez Summit, Mara said, her voice cracking. The cartel bosses I eliminated 7 years ago. They weren't killed to stop the trafficking. They were killed to create a power vacuum so a CIA-backed syndicate could take over the route. We didn't stop the violence. We monopolized it. Silas's eyes scanned down to a file marked St. Petersburg. The Russian general, Silas murmured, feeling a sudden, violent nausea. He wasn't selling nerve gas to terrorists. No, Mara choked out, a tear spilling over her hollow cheek. He was a whistleblower. He had the evidence to expose an Aegis Zero black site in Eastern Europe. He wasn't a monster, Silas. He was a good man trying to stop them. And I was going to kill him. And I did it for you. Silas realized with sickening clarity. He had pulled the trigger to save Mara from her hesitation. He had murdered an innocent man to protect a corrupt machine. Aegis Zero didn't assassinate threats to global security. They assassinated threats to their profit margins. They started the proxy wars. They armed the insurgents. They were the architects of the world's misery. And Silas and Mara had been their most lethal, obedient scalpels. Julian Vane isn't keeping the wolves at bay, Silas whispered, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles popped. He's breeding them. And now, we're the prey, Mara said, shutting the laptop. 3 hours later, the C-17 touched down on a rain-slicked, abandoned airstrip in rural Virginia. The storm was biblical. Sheets of freezing rain lashed at the tarmac as Silas and Mara stole a battered Chevrolet Tahoe from a long-term parking lot and drove south. They were 3 hours from Fayetteville, North Carolina, 3 hours from Lilly. They needed weapons. They needed a fortified vehicle. They needed a miracle. Silas pulled the Tahoe off a desolate, winding mountain road and parked in front of an old, rotting hunting cabin hidden deep in the Shenandoah pines. It was an off-the-books Aegis transit house. Silas knew the biometric bypass codes. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and pine needles. Silas moved immediately to the floorboards in the bedroom, prying up a false panel. Beneath it was a hardened steel lockbox containing stacks of untraceable cash. Fake passports, a pair of suppressed Heckler & Koch HK-416 assault rifles, and hundreds of rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. "Grab the trauma kits," Silas said, tossing a rifle to Mara. "We gear up. We drive straight to Fayetteville. We grab Lily, and we vanish. South America, maybe Southeast Asia, somewhere Vane's satellites can't pierce the canopy." Mara caught the rifle, but she didn't check the action. She just held it, staring blankly at the black steel. "Mara," Silas snapped, his paternal instincts kicking in. "Focus. I need you with me." "He won't stop, Silas," she said quietly. She walked to the dust-caked window, looking out into the raging storm. "Vane has the NSA. He has the CIA. He has infinite money and invisible armies. You can run to the end of the earth. And one day, while Lily is walking home from school, an eraser will put a bullet in her spine from a mile away." "I won't let that happen," Silas growled, slamming a magazine into his rifle. "You can't stop it by running." Mara turned to him, her gray eyes burning with a sudden, desperate intensity. "Silas, Aegis Zero doesn't hunt ghosts. They hunt men with attachments. They hunt fathers." Before Silas could answer, the hairs on his arms stood on end. The heavy, rhythmic thwump, thwump, thwump of suppressed helicopter rotors cut through the sound of the rain. "They found us." "Floodlights," Silas yelled. A second later, the forest outside the cabin erupted in blinding, surgical white light. 4 massive halogen spotlights mounted to an invisible Blackhawk helicopter pinned the cabin in a crossfire of illumination. Peefed, 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 peefed. The front windows shattered inward in a deadly hail of suppressed automatic fire. The walls of the cabin began to literally disintegrate as heavy, armor-piercing rounds chewed through the rotting wood. Silas tackled Mara to the floor, rolling behind the solid brick mass of the fireplace. Plaster dust and wood splinters rained down on them like shrapnel. "Thermal imaging," Silas shouted over the deafening roar of the gunfire. "They're shooting through the walls. We can't stay here." "Back door leads to a ravine," Mara yelled back, blood trickling from a shallow cut on her forehead. "If we can reach the tree line, we can lose them in the thermal wash of the rain. I'll lay down cover. On 3. Silas didn't wait. He leaned out from behind the brick, his HK-416 raised. He couldn't see the shooters through the blinding floodlights, but he aimed at the source of the muzzle flashes in the tree line. He held down the trigger, dumping 20 rounds of suppressive fire into the dark. "Move." Mara sprinted for the rear of the cabin. Silas was right behind her. She kicked open the back door, stepping out into the freezing mud and the torrential rain. A single, suppressed gunshot cracked from the ridge above them. Mara was thrown backward, slamming hard into the doorframe. "Mara," Silas roared, grabbing her by the tactical vest and dragging her out into the blinding storm. Plunging them both down the muddy embankment of the ravine, they tumbled wildly through the brush, sliding 50 feet down into the dark, freezing muck at the bottom of the gorge. Silas scrambled to her side. The rain was washing the blood away as fast as it pumped out of her. But he could see the wound, a through and through to the upper right quadrant of her chest. It had missed her heart, but it had shattered her collarbone and punctured her lung. She was drowning in her own blood. Hey, look at me," Silas said, his hands frantically tearing open a trauma dressing. He pressed the thick gauze against her chest, applying crushing pressure. "I've got you. We're getting out of here." Mara gasped, a wet, rattling sound. She reached up with a trembling, blood-slicked hand and gripped Silas's wrist with surprising strength. I'm not making it to North Carolina. Silas," she choked out, her pale eyes locking onto his. "Shut up. You're the Wraith. You don't die in the mud." "I died a long time ago," Mara whispered, a sad, bloody smile touching her lips. "I'm just finally stopping." Flashlights cut through the trees at the top of the ravine. The erasers were advancing. They had 30 seconds before the kill squad descended. Mara reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a small, Heavy silver thumb drive. She shoved it into Silas's hand. This is the ledger, she gasped. The encrypted drive from the laptop. It's Vane's entire network. The black accounts. The assassinations. Everything. Mara, I'm not leaving you, Silas said, his voice cracking, the cold rain mixing with the hot tears on his face. You have to, she screamed, her voice tearing. Listen to me. You can't run from Vane. You have to use the Oblivion Protocol. Silas stared at her in shock. What? If you go to Lily, you lead the wolves to her door. Mara coughed, blood spilling over her lips. You have to get to Vane. You trade the ledger for Lily's absolute safety. And then, you wipe your mind. You take the protocol. Silas. I won't forget my daughter. I'd rather die. If you die, she has no one. If you remember her, Vane will always have leverage over you. Mara gripped his collar, pulling him down until their faces were inches apart. Her eyes were burning with the desperate, agonizing truth. Aegis Zero doesn't kill civilians if there's no operational need. If Silas Vance ceases to exist, if the ghost is truly dead and his mind is erased, Lily becomes irrelevant to them. It is the only way she lives. You have to die so she can survive. The flashlights were halfway down the ridge. The sweeping red lasers of the erasers cut through the rain. I'll hold them, Mara said, her breathing shallow and frantic. She grabbed her MP7 with her good arm, propping herself up against a rotting fallen oak tree. I've got 2 magazines. I'll funnel them into the choke point. You follow the drainage pipe south. It leads to a highway. Mara. Silas's voice broke. He was a man who had killed 73 people without a second thought. But leaving the woman who had shared his dark was tearing his chest apart. Go be a father, Silas, Mara whispered, her gray eyes softening into something that looked like peace. Let me be the ghost. Silas looked at her one last time. He took the silver drive, shoved it into his pocket, and stood up. He turned and sprinted south through the freezing mud, the darkness swallowing him whole. Behind him, the ravine lit up with the staccato muzzle flashes of an MP7. Mara Thorne, the greatest sniper the Shadow World had ever known, didn't use a scope for her final stand. She fought in the dirt, in the blood, in the rain. Silas ran. He didn't look back when he heard the heavy, sustained return fire of the erasers. He didn't look back when the gunfire abruptly, terrifyingly ceased. He just ran, pushing through the pain, through the rain, driven by the ticking clock of his daughter's life. Mara had bought him the time. Now, he had to pay the price. Director Julian Vane lived in a fortress of glass and steel towering above the Potomac River. His penthouse was a monument to the invisible empire he controlled, impenetrable, heavily guarded by private security, and isolated from the messy reality of the world below. At 4 o'clock hours, the private elevator chimed. Vane stepped out into his sprawling, dimly lit living room, loosening his silk tie. He poured himself a glass of neat Macallan, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The security detail at the lobby desk is dead. Julian, 2 men in the elevator shaft, 3 on the roof. Vane froze. He didn't drop the glass, but his knuckles went white. Sitting in the shadows of Vane's own leather armchair, completely silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Washington, D.C., was Silas Vance. He was covered in dried mud, his tactical gear torn, the scent of pine needles, rain, and fresh blood clinging to him like a shroud. In Silas's right hand was his suppressed SIG M17. It was pointed directly at Vane's chest. Cross, Vane said, his voice remarkably steady for a man whose impregnable fortress had just been dismantled by a single ghost. You look terrible. Mara is dead, Silas said. The words didn't tremble. They were carved from solid ice. I know, Vane replied, taking a slow sip of his scotch. My erasers confirmed the kill before you vanished into the Shenandoah. It was a tragic loss of a very expensive asset. But you're sitting in my home. Which means you didn't come to kill me. If you wanted me dead, I would have taken a bullet through the glass from 2 miles away before I even poured this drink. Silas stood up. He walked slowly across the Persian rug, the heavy combat boots leaving faint tracks of mud. He stopped 3 feet from Vane. He didn't lower the pistol. With his left hand, Silas reached into his tactical vest. He pulled out the heavy silver thumb drive, the ledger Mara had died to protect. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany coffee table. It landed with a heavy, metallic clack. Vane looked down at it. For the first time, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossed his aristocratic features. That drive contains every black account, every unsanctioned assassination, every proxy war Aegis Zero has orchestrated for the last 20 years. Silas said, his voice echoing in the cavernous penthouse. It is the blueprint of your empire. And it is currently tethered to a biometric dead man switch. If my heart stops, or if I don't enter a rolling cryptographic key every 12 hours. That ledger is mass emailed to the servers of the New York Times, WikiLeaks, the FSB, and the director of the CIA. Aegis Zero will burn to the ground, and you will spend the rest of your life in a supermax black site. Vane stared at the silver drive. He was a man of mathematics, and he was currently calculating the odds. He looked back up at Silas. What are your terms, Silas? Lily. Silas breathed, the name catching in his throat like a shard of glass. She gets the life you promised. The trust fund, the schools, the absolute, impenetrable safety. But Aegis Zero never approaches her. You never use her. You never even speak her name. She lives her life completely oblivious to the dark. And in exchange? Vane asked, narrowing his eyes. You hand over the decryption keys? You just walk away? No, Silas said softly, the pistol at his side finally lowered. We both know you'd never stop hunting me. I know too much. As long as I possess the memories of what we did. Lily is leverage, so I am removing the leverage. Vane's eyes widened slightly as the realization hit him. The Oblivion Protocol. I give you the decryption key, Silas said, staring into the eyes of the devil he had served for 7 years. And you put me in the chair. You wipe my mind clean. You burn Silas Vance and the ghost down to the bedrock. You erase Aegis Zero, the sniper rifles, the blood, and you erase my daughter. I become a blank slate. You get your secrets back. And Lily gets her life. Vane set his crystal glass down. It was the perfect compromise. A bloodless victory for the architect. A total defeat for the father. It is a grueling procedure. Silas, Vane said quietly, it will scour your hippocampus. You will not remember your wife's face. You will not remember your child's laugh. You will be a shell. Do we have a deal, Julian? Silas demanded, his voice cracking with the sheer, agonizing weight of what he was surrendering. Vane looked at the silver drive, then at the broken, lethal man standing before him. We have a deal. The medical bay deep beneath Aegis Zero headquarters was blindingly white. It smelled of ozone, sterile alcohol, and cold machinery. Silas was stripped of his muddy tactical gear and dressed in a simple, white hospital gown. He sat in a heavy, mechanized chair that looked like a hybrid between an electric chair and a dentist's recliner. Thick leather straps bound his wrists and ankles. A team of neurologists in white coats moved around him in total silence, attaching dozens of biometric sensors to his chest and temples. Director Vane stood behind a pane of reinforced, polarized glass in the observation room, watching the final moments of his greatest weapon. A doctor approached Silas, holding a heavy, metallic halo wired with thick optic cables. He lowered it onto Silas's head, tightening the cranial clamps. It pinched the skin, sending a dull ache into his skull. The intravenous chemical compound will act as a neurodissolvent, the lead doctor said clinically, tapping a syringe into an IV port snaking into Silas's left arm. The magnetic pulses from the halo will target the episodic memory centers. You will feel a sensation of falling, followed by a burning behind your eyes. Do not fight it. Fighting it causes cerebral hemorrhaging. Silas didn't look at the doctor. He stared straight ahead at the blank white wall. Begin the sequence. Vane's voice crackled over the intercom. The doctor pushed the plunger. Ice fire shot up Silas's arm. It hit his heart a second later, seizing his chest in a terrifying, vice-like grip. The machine around his head powered up, emitting a high-pitched, vibrating hum that rattled his teeth. Sector 1. Deletion. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. Suddenly, he wasn't in the chair. He was in the snow on the rooftop in St. Petersburg. He felt the freezing wind. He saw the crosshairs. He heard the thunderous crack of the Chaitak M200. He saw the Russian general fall. Then, the snow began to dissolve into white static. The sound of the rifle faded into a dull, flat hiss. Mara's face, pale and terrified beside him, began to blur, like watercolor paint left out in the rain. No, Silas gasped, his body jerking against the leather straps. He wanted to hold onto the guild. He deserved the guild. Sector 2. Deletion. The heat of the Sonora Desert. Alejandro Vargas sitting on the terracotta patio. The cigar smoke drifting lazily into the air. The perfect, mathematical flight of the copper bullet. The desert warped, the colors inverted, the memory shattered into a million digital fragments and was sucked into the blinding white void. He forgot the math. He forgot the wind. He forgot how to pull the trigger. Sector 3. Deletion. Vault 9. The heavy steel doors. A woman with raven black hair and pale gray eyes sitting under a halogen lamp, wiping down a fluted barrel. Where I live, in the dark, there is no room for fathers. Her voice echoed, echoing, until it was just a frequency. And then, nothing. He forgot the wraith. He forgot the woman who had fought beside him, bled with him, and died for him in the freezing Virginia mud. Core memory engagement. Sector 4. Final deletion. Silas's heart monitor spiked erratically. A tear leaked from his tightly shut eyes, tracing a hot path down his cheek. He was standing in a hallway. The light was warm and golden. He pushed open a door. There was a bed with a star-patterned quilt. A little girl with dark hair and missing front teeth was laughing. The smell of maple syrup and strawberry shampoo filled his lungs. It was so real he could touch it. He could feel the warmth of her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Dad, you're squeezing my ribs. Please," Silas sobbed out loud in the sterile medical bay, his voice breaking into a ragged, pathetic wail. The chemical fire was burning his brain to ash. He fought the restraints. He fought the machine. He tried to hold onto the golden light. "Please, not her. Keep her. Let me keep her." The little girl looked at him. Her smile began to fade. The borders of the bedroom dissolved into static. He reached out for her in the void. His fingers brushed the fabric of the stuffed rabbit. "Mr. Hops." The golden light flickered. The smell of strawberry shampoo evaporated. The girl's face turned to white noise. Her name. What was her name? Lee. The letters drifted away like smoke. The concept of being a father detached from his soul and floated into the abyss. The love, the agonizing, beautiful, crushing love that had defined his entire existence, was cleanly, surgically severed. In the medical bay, Silas Vance stopped thrashing. His body went entirely limp against the leather straps. His eyes slowly opened. They were completely blank. The dark, haunted depths of the ghost were gone. The fierce, desperate love of the father was gone. There was only a quiet, terrifying emptiness. The machine spun down, the hum dying away. The doctors stepped back, checking the monitors. A flat, green baseline confirmed the total erasure of the episodic hippocampus. Through the glass, Director Vane pressed a button on the intercom. "Do you know who you are?" Vane asked. The man in the chair blinked slowly. He looked at the white walls, at his own hands, and then at the glass. He felt a phantom ache in his chest. A hollow space where something massive used to live. But he didn't know what it was. He didn't know why he was crying. He took a slow, deep breath. "I am not dying," the man whispered to the empty room, his voice soft and devoid of history. "I am just becoming someone who doesn't have to hurt anymore." 10 years later. The wind sweeping through Glacier National Park in Montana didn't carry the scent of cordite or aviation fuel. It smelled of ancient pine, damp earth, and the crisp, biting promise of early snow. Arthur Penn sat on the porch of his ranger cabin, wrapping his calloused hands around a steaming mug of black coffee. He was a quiet man, in his late 40s. His hair was graying at the temples, and his eyes carried the calm, distant gaze of someone who spent more time with mountains than with people. He didn't have much of a past. According to his official state records, Arthur had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury in a terrible car accident a decade ago. It had wiped his episodic memory completely clean. He didn't remember his childhood. He didn't remember if he had ever been in love. He only knew the quiet life he had built since the hospital. The rhythm of the seasons. The migration patterns of the elk. The silence of the deep woods. Arthur took a sip of his coffee. He looked out across the vast, plunging valley below his cabin. Automatically, without thinking, his mind registered the rustle of the pine needles. Wind is quartering from the northwest. 12 knots. Temperature dropping. Barometric pressure stabilizing. He frowned slightly, staring at his own hands. They were scarred, thick with muscle memory he couldn't explain. Sometimes, when he held a heavy flashlight or a trail-clearing axe, his fingers would instinctively curl, searching for a trigger guard that wasn't there. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake up covered in sweat, his heart hammering, the phantom echo of a thunderous gunshot ringing in his right ear. And sometimes, he felt an agonizing, hollow ache in the center of his chest, like a massive, vital organ had been surgically removed, leaving only a ghost behind. He didn't know what it was he was missing. He just knew it had been beautiful. But the mountains were quiet, and the ache always passed. Arthur set his mug down, grabbed his heavy wool coat, and climbed into his green Forest Service truck. It was his day off, and he needed to make the hour-long drive into town for supplies. The grocery store in Kalispell was brightly lit and humming with the mundane energy of civilian life. Soft pop music played over the crackling speakers. The squeak of shopping cart wheels echoed down the aisles. Arthur was standing in the produce section, examining a bruised Honeycrisp apple, when he bumped into a woman turning the corner. "Oh, excuse me," Arthur said, taking a polite step back, his deep voice rumbling in his chest. "My fault. I wasn't looking," she replied. Arthur looked up. The woman was in her early 40s. She wore a thick, knitted gray sweater and a simple scarf. Her raven black hair was tied back in a messy knot. Her eyes were a pale, striking gray. For one singular heartbeat, the universe stopped spinning. Arthur stared into those gray eyes, and a violent, electric shock ripped through the base of his spine. The air in the grocery store suddenly felt incredibly thin. A flash of blinding white snow. The deafening crack of a rifle. The smell of copper and freezing rain, the fragmented, broken shards of a deleted life slammed against the reinforced walls of his wiped mind. The woman froze, too. She dropped her gaze to his hands, then looked back up at his face. Her breath hitched. Her gray eyes widened with a profound, terrifying recognition that had no name, no context, and no history. Aegis Zero didn't waste expensive assets. When Mara Thorne bled out in the Virginia mud, Director Vane hadn't let her die. He had sent a medical evac team. He had patched the holes in her chest, strapped her to the mechanized chair, and erased the wraith from existence, just as he had erased the ghost. They stood there in the produce aisle. Two of the deadliest assassins the shadow world had ever created. Two ghosts who had bled together, fought together, and sacrificed their very souls for each other. They stood inches apart, and they didn't know each other's names. The spark of recognition flared, bright and agonizing, but there was no tinder left to catch the fire. The Oblivion Protocol had done its job flawlessly. The memories were ash. Arthur blinked, the phantom echo fading back into the dark. The terrifying tension in his shoulders released. He offered a polite, somewhat apologetic smile. "Rough weather moving in tonight," Arthur said, gesturing vaguely to the front of the store. The woman blinked, pulling her sweater a little tighter around her shoulders. The haunted, confused look in her gray eyes smoothed over into polite civilian indifference. "Yes," she said softly, her voice smooth and even. "I suppose it is. Have a good day." "You too, ma'am." Arthur Vance and Mara Thorne turned their backs to one another. They walked away down opposite aisles, disappearing into the fluorescent-lit maze of the grocery store, forever lost to the dark, and forever lost to each other. 2,000 miles away, in Washington, D.C., the autumn leaves were falling over the campus of Georgetown University. Lily Vance sat on a stone bench overlooking the Potomac River, wearing a black graduation gown, a law degree resting heavily in her lap. She was 26 years old. She was brilliant, fiercely independent, and completely, blissfully safe. She had never known the horrors of the world. She had never known the men in the shadows who moved the geopolitical chess pieces. Her life had been an unbroken string of prestigious boarding schools, fully funded scholarships from an anonymous trust, and a quiet, invisible bubble of absolute protection. A gentle breeze blew off the river, rustling the heavy fabric of her gown. Lily unzipped a small compartment in her leather purse and pulled out a faded, creased photograph. It was the only tangible piece of her past she had left. It was a picture of a man in an army combat uniform. He was kneeling in the grass, holding a smiling, gap-toothed little girl who was clutching a stuffed rabbit. The sun glare in the photograph washed out the man's face completely. He was just a silhouette, a shadow holding onto the light. Lily's mother had died of cancer. And her father had died in a training accident when she was 9. At least, that was what the men in the charcoal gray suits had told her. A closed casket funeral, a folded flag, and then, a lifetime of anonymous checks that paid for her future. She didn't know about Aegis Zero. She didn't know about the 73 ghosts. She didn't know about the 4,000-meter shots, the bleeding in the mud, or the mechanized chair in the blinding white medical bay. She just knew that whenever she felt afraid, whenever the world seemed too big or too dark, she felt a strange, comforting presence, like someone was watching over her from a very long way away. Lily smiled, a warm, beautiful smile that her father had bought with his very soul. She kissed her fingertips, pressed them to the faded silhouette of the man in the photograph, and tucked the picture safely back into her bag. She stood up, turned her face to the sun and walked forward into a bright, unbroken future. The world is quiet tonight. You will go to sleep in a warm bed. You will wake up tomorrow, drink your coffee, and complain about the traffic. You will read the news and think you understand how the gears of history turn. But the world is not quiet because the monsters are gone. The world is quiet because there are walls built in the dark. And standing on those walls are people who have traded their names, their memories, and their very souls to hold the line. You will never know their names. You will never read about their sacrifices in a history book. And they will never ask for your gratitude. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes don't save the world by being remembered. They save the world by choosing to be forgotten. Thank you for listening to The Silent Debt. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, or if it made you hold your loved ones a little tighter tonight, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Tell me, if you had to give up your memories to save the person you love most, could you sit in the chair? Until next time, stay out of the dark.